Number 8. Connie Converse. Connie Converse was born in New Hampshire in 1924. From an early age, she displayed high intelligence, excelled in all subjects at school, and graduated as valedictorian of her high school class. She was offered a scholarship to Mount Holyoke College, but she dropped out after her sophomore year and moved to New York City to pursue her dream of becoming a writer. While in New York City, she successfully published essays, and in her spare time wrote poetry, painted, and drew cartoons. After teaching herself to play guitar, Converse seemed to have discovered her true life's calling as a musician. Converse is considered to be one of the earliest known musicians in the singer-songwriter genre, and her unique musical style, which combined elements of blues, folk, country, pop, and jazz, was considered to be ahead of her time. However, by the early 1950s, few had ever heard her music, with most of her songs existing only as home recordings, which she mailed to her brother and his wife. In 1954, Converse was encouraged by a friend to perform at a club where the animator and music enthusiast Gene Deitch sometimes made recordings of performers. Her performance impressed both the audience and Deitch, who used his connections to get Converse an appearance on CBS's morning show, hosted by Walter Cronkite. Many thought that this would be the breakthrough moment that launched Converse's career, but like many artists who are viewed as ahead of their time, her musical style had no contemporary audience, and the appearance went nowhere. Converse attempted to reinvent herself, learning piano and continuing to evolve her musical style, but by 1961, she had become frustrated with her inability to find an audience for her music and decided to relocate to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where she wrote for an academic journal while also working on a novel. In the early 1970s, she suffered a nervous breakdown, and in 1974, shortly after her 50th birthday, she got into her Volkswagen Beetle and drove away, never to be seen again. Shortly before her disappearance, she mailed several letters to family and friends announcing her need to start over somewhere new. In one of the letters, she wrote, "Let me go. Let me be if I can. Let me not be if I can't. Human society fascinates me and awes me and fills me with grief and joy. I just can't find my place to plug into it." Converse was a notoriously private and reclusive person even before her disappearance, to the point of never having any kind of romantic relationship in her life. For a time, her family respected her decision to start over and didn't look for her. A few years after her disappearance, someone reported to her brother that he had seen a telephone listing for an Elizabeth Converse in either Oklahoma or Kansas, but this lead was not pursued at that time. By the mid-1980s, after not having heard from her in a decade, her brother contacted a private investigator to see if he could locate Connie. The investigator told him that he might be able to find Connie, but that even if he did, Connie would have no obligation to return or even speak with her family, as adults of sound mind have the right to disappear. Since then, he chose to respect her wishes and ceased looking for her. In 2015, La Durette Recordings released an album, How Sad, How Lovely, consisting of 17 original songs by Converse. The album was met with nearly universal praise by music critics, and in 2017, an album of covers of Converse's works by a variety of artists was released. Is Converse perhaps still alive somewhere, maybe quietly enjoying the fact that over 60 years since she first tried to break into the music industry, her work is finally getting some recognition? If she is still alive, as of the time of this video, she would be 93 years old. Number 7. Joe Pichler. Joe Pichler was a former child actor from Bremerton, Washington. He appeared in supporting roles in several movies and television shows, most notably the third and fourth sequels in the Beethoven film franchise. In 2006, Pichler was 18 years old and back living in his hometown of Bremerton, and having completed high school, was planning to return to Hollywood to continue his acting career. On January 3rd, 2006, Pichler had 4 friends over visiting at his apartment. At around 2 a.m., he drove 2 of them home. At 4 a.m., Pichler called one of his friends. He was upset and crying and said he couldn't stop drinking. He said he would call the friend back in an hour, but never did. This is the last trace of Pichler. He has never been seen or heard from again. His family reported him missing on January 5th. Later that same day, his car was discovered abandoned near the Port Madison Narrows. Pichler's car contained a 2-page letter, which police believe was a suicide note. However, Pichler's family and friends dispute this, stating it was simply creative writing, and there is no hard evidence that Pichler committed suicide. Police believed he may have jumped off the Port Madison Narrows, but search dogs didn't detect his scent in the area. According to an unverified report, the Bremerton police focused too quickly on the suicide angle and made several errors in the investigation, such as not processing Pichler's vehicle for forensic evidence, failing to interview the people who were last seen with Pichler, and performing only a cursory 3-minute search of Pichler's apartment. If he is still alive, Pichler would be 31 years old at the time of this video. Number 6. Jim Sullivan. Jim Sullivan was an Irish-American musician born in 1940 in San Diego. He grew up in government housing projects listening to blues music as a teenager, which inspired him to become a musician. In the 1960s, he performed in a band, but by the late 1960s, he decided to go solo. His style, which combined elements of folk, rock, and country, proved popular in clubs in the Los Angeles area, and in 1969, a group of his friends and fans helped him raise funds to record an album titled UFO. Capitol Records passed on the album, but it eventually found release on a small independent label. In 1970, it was re-released on a larger label, but failed to make an impact. Undaunted for the time, Sullivan continued to perform in clubs, and in 1972, he released a follow-up album simply titled Jim Sullivan. Again, the album failed to make an impact. Depressed over his career and increasingly turning to alcohol, in 1975, Sullivan decided to pack up and move to Nashville in hopes of finding success there. Loading his VW Bug with some clothes, his guitar, and a box of unsold records, he set off on the long drive from California to Tennessee, promising his wife and son that he would send for them once he'd earned some money. 18 hours into his journey, he was pulled over by a policeman near Santa Rosa, New Mexico, for swerving. He was administered a sobriety test, which he passed. Sullivan was simply tired from his long drive. The policeman directed him to a motel in Santa Rosa, insisting that he get some sleep before he continued. Sullivan checked into the motel, but it is unlikely that he stayed there, as the bed was never slept in. He called his wife from the motel and told her that he was staying in town until the next day. When she asked why, he said, "If I told you, you wouldn't believe me." That phone call was the last time anyone has heard from Jim Sullivan. The next day, his car was found abandoned on ranch land 26 miles outside of town, with all of Sullivan's belongings inside. According to some sources, some ranch hands observed him walking away from his car, but this sighting cannot be verified. There are many theories as to what happened to Sullivan. Firstly, some speculate that Sullivan simply chose to disappear. Allegedly, he had once told his manager that if he was going to disappear, he would simply walk out into the desert, and the unverified sighting of him by the ranch hands would seem to support this theory. Another theory is that he was killed by the owners of the ranch, who were reputed to have mafia ties and moved to Hawaii shortly after Sullivan disappeared, and according to other, unverified reports, were seen arguing with Sullivan about why he was parking his car on their property. Lastly, due to both the title of his first album and his cryptic comment to his wife in the phone call the day before he disappeared, some even believe he was abducted by aliens. Interestingly, Sullivan's case shares many similarities with that of Connie Converse's. Both were singer-songwriters, both were depressed about their failure to break into the music industry despite devoted fan followings, and both were last seen driving VW Bugs. And, like Converse, both achieved greater success decades after they had disappeared. In 2010, Sullivan's album UFO was re-released by Light in the Attic Records, where it received high critical praise. If he is still alive at the time of this video, Sullivan would be 78 years old. Number 5. Alanya Carisi. Alanya Carisi was born in 1970 into a famous Italian family. Her parents, Albano Carisi and Romina Power, were both well-known singers and actors in Italy. In 1983, at the age of 13, Carisi made her acting debut alongside her parents in the Italian film Champagne in Paradise. In 1989, she served in Vanna White's role as the letter turner in the Italian version of Wheel of Fortune. In the early 1990s, she studied literature at King's College in London, where she had the highest marks in her class. She aspired to become a novelist, and for her first novel, she planned to travel the world with nothing but a backpack and a journal and turn her experiences into a book. In 1993, she spent time in Central and South America and later moved on to New Orleans, Louisiana, where she spent time with the city's homeless and street musicians. One of those street musicians was a 54-year-old cornet player named Alexander Masekela, whom Carisi was reportedly fascinated with. In December of 1993, she left New Orleans and traveled to Florida, where her parents were vacationing, and told them that she feared that two men were trying to drug and kill her. Despite this, she eventually decided to return to New Orleans, telling her parents she wanted to find characters for the book she was writing. Back in New Orleans, she stayed with Masekela in a seedy hotel near the city's famous French Quarter, where Masekela worked as a busker. Carisi's parents last heard from her on January 1st, 1994, when she phoned them in Florida. On the evening of January 6th, a security guard saw a woman jump into the Mississippi River after saying, "I belong in water." The Coast Guard searched the area, but the woman's body was never found. After being shown photos of Carisi, the security guard tentatively identified her as the woman he saw. Her parents were suspicious of Masekela, whom they described as having a hold over their daughter. He was questioned by police and released, and there is no concrete evidence that he was involved in her disappearance. He also denied having a sexual relationship with Carisi, pointing out that when they checked into the hotel together, Carisi specifically requested a room with 2 beds. Masekela was eventually evicted from the hotel when he attempted to use Carisi's traveler's checks to continue paying for his room. It should also be noted that he was arrested on January 31st when an ex-girlfriend accused him of rape, but was not charged due to a lack of evidence. Masekela believes that Carisi was not the woman who jumped into the Mississippi River, saying that he believes that she is still alive. Carisi's parents also believed she was alive, and spent considerable time and effort pursuing leads in attempts to locate her. Eventually, their marriage crumbled. Her father stated in 2006 that he now believes the security guard's story and believes Carisi drowned. Her mother continues to believe she is alive and speculates that her disappearance was related to black magic rituals. In 2011, a German publication reported that Carisi had been located alive and well and living in a convent near Phoenix, Arizona, a report that her father dismissed as shameful speculation containing not a bit of truth. It is unknown how the publication came by this information or how seriously this lead was pursued. In 2014, Albano had his daughter declared legally dead. In 2015, an Italian newspaper reported that a trucker had confessed to murdering a woman in 1996 who resembled Carisi and called herself Suzanne, which was an alias that Carisi was known to have used while traveling in the United States. Her father's DNA was taken for comparison to the deceased woman, which determined that the woman was not Carisi. If she is still alive, Carisi would be 48 years old. Number 4. Licorice McKechnie. Christina Licorice McKechnie was born in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1945. In her teens, she left home and spent time reading in poetry clubs in Scotland and mingling with people in the counterculture scene. She started dating and later intended to marry Scottish folk musician Bert Jansch, but instead traveled to Morocco with Robin Williamson, a founder of the psychedelic folk group The Incredible String Band. She ended up forming a relationship with Williamson and joined the band as a backup vocalist and percussionist. She can be heard on the group's second album, The 5,000 Spirits or The Layers of the Onion, and performed with the band at Woodstock in 1969. In 1972, she left the band after the deterioration of her relationship with Williamson. McKechnie was an early member of the Church of Scientology, and in 1974, she performed at a benefit for the church along with several other folk musicians. Throughout the remainder of the 1970s, she performed with a variety of folk bands and eventually left Scientology. In 1986, she visited her family in Scotland. From this point on, no one is exactly sure what happened to her. According to the music journalist Mark Ellen, she was last seen in 1987 hitchhiking across the Arizona desert. Her eldest sister stated she received a letter from her in 1990, postmarked from Sacramento, California, which stated that she was recovering from surgery. In 2008, a poster on a forum for ex-Scientologists claimed that he was confident he had located her alive and well in California, and that she was hiding in plain sight and enjoying her obscurity, and out of respect for her privacy, he would not reveal any more details. If she is still alive, Licorice McKechnie would be 72 years old. Number 3. Edward L. Montoro. Born in 1928, Edward Montoro's greatest ambition was to be an airline pilot. Instead, for many years, he worked a variety of jobs, including television repairman and industrial painter. Eventually, he began training for his dream job, only to have it dashed when a plane crash nearly killed him, leaving Montoro with severe injuries requiring physical therapy and reconstructive surgery. Then in his early 40s, Montoro chose to move into an entirely new field, film production. Montoro gambled nearly all of his life savings on his new venture, investing $13,000 of his own money into his first film, the 1970s softcore pornographic comedy Getting Into Heaven, which he wrote, produced, and directed. The film wound up earning $750,000, making back over 50 times its budget. Montoro began recruiting investors and in 1972 founded his own production company, Film Ventures International, or FVI. The company both produced its own low-budget films and acquired the rights to distribute foreign films in the United States. In 1975, FVI acquired the rights to the Italian horror film Beyond the Door, widely regarded as a ripoff of The Exorcist. Warner Brothers, which owned the rights to The Exorcist, even filed an injunction against FVI to attempt to stop them from distributing the film in the States, but wound up losing in court. Beyond the Door ended up earning $35 million worldwide, equivalent to around $160 million in 2018 dollars, and was for a time the highest-grossing independent film. Throughout the rest of the 70s, FVI continued to release both foreign films and its own B-movies and enjoyed tidy profits. In 1982, FVI acquired the rights to another Italian horror film, Great White, an obvious rip-off of Jaws. It was so similar to Jaws that Universal Pictures sued for copyright infringement, and this time FVI lost the court case, resulting in Great White being pulled from theaters. While this lost the studio some money, it did not, as some have reported, lead to the studio's downfall, as FVI continued to release films for several more years. By the mid-1980s, however, FVI was in serious financial trouble, as a number of factors, including a decline in popularity of drive-in theaters, which were more likely to show B-movies than traditional theaters, and the rise of VCRs, which required studios to invest large amounts of money into home video releases, made FVI's business model unprofitable. In late 1984, the company filed for bankruptcy. The January 1985 edition of Box Office magazine reported that Montoro was blamed for the company's downfall, as he had invested $1 million into the box office failure Mutant against the advice of all members of his executive staff. Montoro could not be reached for comment, as he was on a leave of absence at the time. That leave of absence has now been over 30 years. In the year prior to his disappearance, Montoro had began divorce proceedings with his wife, which likely contributed to his decision to disappear. Before he left, he managed to steal $1 million from FVI's bank accounts, but he left everything else, his house, his Rolls-Royce, and his yacht, behind. Montoro had been reportedly learning Spanish before he fled, and many suspect that he made his way to Mexico under a false name, although this theory has never been proven. If he is alive today, Montoro would be 90 years old. Number 2. Hugh Lazarus. Kiana Diana, better known by her stage name Hugh Lazarus, was an American singer known as the frontwoman of her band, Hugh Lazarus and the Resurrection. Much about her personal life remains a mystery. Her last name is unknown, as is her exact birth date. What is known is that she was born in New Jersey, married young, and escaped her abusive marriage by fleeing to New York City, where she worked as a nanny and later a cab driver while making music on the side. One night, her taxi's passenger was Jonathan Demme, a film producer, screenwriter, and director. Demme heard her demo tape playing in the cab and was so impressed that he took her to Hollywood and attempted to get her signed to a record deal, only to be told by music executives that Lazarus wasn't marketable. Despite this, her music was featured in several films in the mid to late 80s, including Demme's own film, Married to the Mob, where Lazarus's most famous song, Goodbye Horses, first debuted. The song was featured again in Demme's 1991 film, The Silence of the Lambs, and immediately became popular as the Buffalo Bill song, the song that plays when the psychotic killer Buffalo Bill performs his cross-dressing routine, a scene that has been parodied in a number of films and television shows. In 1993, Lazarus again provided a song for a Jonathan Demme film, a cover of the Talking Heads song Heaven for the film Philadelphia, and Lazarus even had a small cameo in the film. A few years after this, however, in 1996, Lazarus broke up with her band and dropped out of sight. The fact that Lazarus has a large amount of unclaimed royalties owed to her has led many to suspect that she may be deceased, although it was reported in 2007 that one of her former bandmates, William Garvey, was contacted by someone claiming to represent her. Interviews with former bandmates and friends only adds fuel to the mystery. One former friend, who met Lazarus in 1985, was told by Lazarus that she was 20 at the time, but the friend suspects that she was older than she claimed. The same friend states that in the late 1980s, Lazarus traveled to the United Kingdom, where she attempted to start a heavy metal band, and wound up befriending a shady Swedish hustler and cokehead who isolated her from many of her friends. However, she must have returned to the States at some point after that, due to her work on Philadelphia in 1993. For whatever reason, it seems that, like the horses, Lazarus decided to say goodbye to fame. Number 1. Tammy Lynn Leppard. Tammy Leppard was born in Florida in 1965. From the age of 4, she was involved in modeling and competed in child beauty pageants. In her teens, she became involved in acting, and in 1982, she landed a small role in the teen comedy film Spring Break. After the film wrapped, she went out of town unchaperoned to a weekend party, and according to her family and friends, she came back a different person. Leppard became reclusive and paranoid, and believed that people were spying on her and planning to harm her. She was paranoid about eating and drinking, fearing that someone was trying to poison her. She told her mother that she had seen something horrible while at the party, and as a result, they were trying to kill her. She would not tell her mother who they were. A few weeks later, Leppard was offered a small role in the Al Pacino film Scarface. For the first 4 days she was on set, everything went fine, but on the 5th day, during filming of a violent scene, she became hysterical, suffering a complete nervous breakdown, and during her fit, she mentioned money laundering. She left filming and returned home. Her mother took her to see the local police, and Leppard was interviewed, but she did not mention to them that she believed her life was in danger. On July 1st, 1983, Leppard suffered a violent breakdown, smashing windows in her home and attacking a longtime family friend named Wing Flanagan because she believed that Wing had locked her out of her home. After this incident, her mother checked her into a mental health facility where it was determined that she was not abusing drugs or alcohol. Leppard was released after 72 hours observation, and upon returning home, she told her mother that if anything happened to her, she wanted her mother to get even with a specific person who has not been publicly named. A day later, she told a friend that she was probably going to be leaving soon. On July 6th, she left home with another male friend who stated that as they were driving, they had an argument which ended with Tammy demanding to be let out of his car. He dropped her off at a parking lot in downtown Cocoa Beach, Florida. She has not been seen since. Based on Leppard's behavior prior to her disappearance, many suspect her disappearance involved foul play and was related to money laundering. Interestingly, investigations regarding money laundering were occurring in the area at the time, but nothing was uncovered to connect these operations to Leppard's disappearance. Some believe that due to her fears, whether they be real or imagined, she chose to disappear voluntarily, and some point to her comment to her friend about going away soon as evidence for this, although her friend stated she may have only been referring to an upcoming trip to California to film a movie. Some believe she suffered another breakdown and may be homeless or in a mental hospital somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia. The friend who was last seen with Leppard and allegedly dropped her off was considered a suspect in her disappearance, but no evidence against him was ever found. Another suspect in her disappearance is Christopher Wilder, a serial killer from Australia known as the Beauty Queen Killer. Wilder was an amateur photographer, and part of his MO was to entice attractive women with offers of modeling work, and he even stalked one of his victims after seeing her perform in a modeling contest promoted by the magazine 17 during a violent 6-week cross-country crime spree in 1984 in which he murdered at least 8 women. Wilder was eventually recognized by 2 policemen at a service station in New Hampshire. As they attempted to arrest him, Wilder pulled out a gun, and in the ensuing struggle he was shot and killed. Leppard's family for a time believed that Wilder had killed her. However, in recent years, her sister has stated that she no longer believes that Wilder was responsible for Tammy's disappearance. It should also be noted that Wilder's crime spree began a year after Tammy had vanished. Another person of interest in her case was John Crutchley, a convicted kidnapper and rapist. He was known as the vampire rapist because he drained almost 50% of his victim's blood while assaulting and nearly killing her. Although he was never officially charged with any murders, some investigators believe he may have been a serial killer with as many as 30 victims, and an FBI psychological profile on Crutchley identifies him as displaying the personality traits of a serial killer. Many, however, including Leppard's sister, do not believe he was involved in her disappearance. Crutchley died in prison in 2002 in what was either a suicide or a botched attempt at autoerotic asphyxiation. Leppard's behavior prior to her disappearance has led some to speculate that she was suffering from undiagnosed mental illness, possibly bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. However, her behavior was also similar to that of someone suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Her extreme reaction, triggered by the bloody scene in Scarface, is a classic example of a violent event causing someone with PTSD to have a flashback to a previous violent event they had witnessed. This leads to the question, what did Tammy see at the party? And did someone decide that she was a loose end that needed to be tied up? If Tammy Lynn Leppard is still alive, she would be 52 years old. Thanks so much for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please like and subscribe and check out my other videos.